history seems to follow you in your most recent diplomatic posts. You have been on the front lines of two of the biggest geopolitical stories in the Asia-Pacific region over the last decade, the transition to democracy in Burma/Myanmar, as well as the unrest here in Hong Kong. Let's talk about Myanmar. Do you see this coup that happened yesterday a death blow to the nascent democracy movement in Myanmar?
Well, Stephen, I hope, really hope it's not a death blow. It is certainly a massive setback. And having been in Myanmar at the time when Myanmar came out of a long period of military dictatorship, moved to a period of hope and optimism. And for the problems that it's had in recent years, and nobody's trying to underestimate what those have been, there were free and fair elections that took place in November. The people voted again for the NLD led by Aung San Suu Kyi. And this is just a clear, just trying to trample over the wishes of the Myanmar people on the basis of the most tenuous claims, I mean, and quite frankly, absurd claims of vote rigging on a beyond industrial scale.
Yeah, the National Election Commission has called this election transparent and fair, but the generals do not agree. Does this move and then the subsequent possible return of sanctions from the U.S. and others return Myanmar to pariah state?
Well, that must be the risk, Stephen. And I was in Myanmar in my early days from 2009 through to sort of 2010, 2011, when that was exactly the status that Myanmar had. And it was a country full of fear and anxiety and very little hope. And, you know, the sanctions were lifted because of the process of democratic reform. And that, as President Biden and his spokesman have made very clear today. So if that is reversed, then there is an obvious consequence of that. But sanctions are but one of the tools available to the international community. It is so important that the international community, as it has done so far, really makes clear that this is unacceptable. And it's interesting that it's not just which countries have spoken, it's the level at which they've done that, be it with the president in the US, the prime minister in the UK, the UN Secretary General, and so on. And I think this is sending a very clear message, and that must lead, in the end, there is a very serious risk that we'll get into some dreadful Groundhog Day when Myanmar will go back to being a pariah nation.
Ambassador, why did the generals make this move now? 4 years ago, they acquiesced and allowed the election to go forward. Aung San Suu Kyi did become state councilor, the de facto head of state. But 4 years later, it's a different scenario. Were they emboldened perhaps by diplomatic channels with the Chinese, with what has happened in neighboring Thailand, with the ruling generals ruling there? Why did they take this move now? Did they see an irreversible mandate being given to Aung San Suu Kyi?
I think it probably was that more than some of the other factors that you've mentioned. It's hard to know what went on behind the scenes in Myanmar's diplomatic relationships with other nations. But what the military faced here, they wrote a constitution which they have now just thrown out of the window, frankly, in what they've done. But they wrote a constitution which guaranteed that they would preserve really important powers, both the seats within the parliament that meant they could block any constitutional change, key offices of state that were going to be guaranteed to the military. Now, what I think they were afraid of was that with a second term for Aung San Suu Kyi, a landslide victory in which the military parties were trounced, I mean, really trounced, that there was going to be overwhelming pressure for constitutional change that might start to erode those powers that the military were clinging onto. And right. I think when they had all the parliamentarians, it was supposed to be the first day of the parliament, gathered there today in Naypyidaw, I think they saw their chance to do this.
Ambassador, you know Aung San Suu Kyi fairly well. I've met her once, interviewed her, though 25 years ago in her home. A lot has changed. She's a tough individual. I think you would agree with that. Did she make some missteps, though, in the handling? And some would say maybe taking too much of a pragmatic approach with the generals. She was vilified internationally after being lionized earlier when she won of course, the Nobel Peace Prize. But did she make some missteps that have basically proven her strategy wrong, given yesterday's coup?
Well, I would question that, Stephen. I mean, of course, I think any politician, anyone in a position of power will make some missteps. That's inevitable. But actually, what she tried to do was to come to some form of accommodation with the military. They, from what I could see, largely pushed back against that. Now, what happened was, regardless of Daw Suu, any missteps or not that she may have made, the Myanmar people voted overwhelmingly for her to return as president. And the military have just tried to wipe that out, what they have done today.
Ambassador, is this a kind of behind-the-scenes power play by China to gain influence in Southeast Asia through the generals? I mean, you were here on the front lines in Hong Kong. You saw the moves by Beijing here to quash democracy here in Hong Kong. Do you see parallels?
It's really difficult to say, Stephen. I mean, the types of conversations that go on between the military commander-in-chief, he certainly met the Chinese foreign minister when he came over in January, but then so did Daw Suu. And China actually made a pretty good relationship with Daw Suu's government. So look, it is really hard to tell exactly what China's view on this is. What I would say is that, you know, the democratic reform process that took place during the beginning of the last decade, China was clearly involved in that, but it wasn't a driver of it. And so I think China is clearly hugely important in this, but I think it's maybe overstating it to think that the military government wouldn't make a move either way without China's approval.